Sometimes a small space can pack a lot of history. Hi, I'm Sean with the Sacramento History Museum. Allie, who produces the Facebook Live, has joined me. We have escaped Old Sacramento. We have gone 9 blocks inland from the Sacramento River. We are now near the corner of 9th and I Streets, and we are at the Cesar Chavez Plaza. And that's not the small space that I was going to tell you about, but I thought I'd talk about this small space on our way to that destination. The plaza was one of the 10 original town squares laid out when the city was founded after the gold rush at the commission of John Sutter Jr. He had been summoned from Switzerland by his father, Captain John Sutter, who didn't fare too well in the gold rush and asked his son to help settle affairs. John Sutter Jr. then turned to 2 Army cartographers, one Captain William Warren, the other a young Lieutenant William Tecumseh Sherman, who was helping build a brand new city here, and then 15 years later was helping to destroy the cities of Atlanta and Savannah as a general during the Civil War. So, but before that, of course, this area has remnants, archaeological evidence of a southern Miwok Indian settlement, a village, archaeological evidence here, and you can find a marker for that over at the City Hall. Now, when this was a park, it was briefly thought of, I'm going to turn it around so you can see it and not me. It was briefly thought of as a site for the state capitol. The city was concerned that that was a violation of its charter, and so it was deeded back to the city. The capitol is now 3 blocks southeast of where we are. This plaza is a focal point for concerts, summer concerts, and the farmers market, at least before the pandemic. It is also the centerpiece for social protests, because the City Hall is, I'll press the button again, is right across the street. It has also become a haven and oasis for the growing homeless crisis in the city. People live on the streets here at I and 10th Street primarily, and volunteer groups bring food and other items to them regularly here in the park. It wasn't much of a park in the beginning. It was pretty much a grassy patch. And when the city curiously when the city lifted after the terrible floods of 1861-62, this square was not lifted. It was charitably called a sunken garden. It was fenced all around so people wouldn't fall in, I guess, and then it was pigs foraged in the garbage, and it was a temporary pen for cattle. And then it was remade into an actual park in 1872 with the crisscross sidewalks that are still in place here in the park. In 1899, this statue was put in place to honor Andrew Jackson Stevens, a Vermonter who was a master mechanic at the Southern Pacific Railroad. Leland Stanford had hired him. He died fairly young, 55, after a short illness, and he was considered a friend of labor. That's what it says on the plaque. And his co-workers raised the money for this statue, and some 10,000 to 12,000 people gathered in the park for the dedication of this bronze statue of A.J. Stevens. The original fountain in the park was replaced in 1927 by the one I'm approaching. This is the William Coleman fountain, memorial fountain, paid for by his widow, Florence. William Coleman was an early settler of the city, and he invested in real estate. This was done by sculptor Ralph Stackpole of San Francisco, and you can see the influences that the Mexican artist Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, and Jose Orozco had on his work. These represent 3 California Indian women who in turn represent 3 rivers flowing into the Sacramento River. This is the American, Bear, and Feather rivers flowing into the Sacramento. But I'm talking about an even smaller space, which I'm approaching here. Ali, our producer, was just not fast enough to get out of the shot. She tries so hard. Now we are going over here because since 1999, this park was named after Cesar Chavez, the civil rights icon and co-founder of the United Farm Workers Union. It is March 31st. It is Cesar Chavez Day. It is his birthday. The civil rights leader passed away in 1993 at age 66. He was born in 1927, 94 years ago. And in 1999, this park was named for him following his death. And the centerpiece, the small space I'm talking about that packs a lot of history, is right in front of me. This sculpture by Lisa Reinertsen, who is a sculptor based in Benicia. Lisa Reinertsen, here's my connection to the museum. Please come to the museum. You will see another work by Lisa Reinertsen, the bust of Aubrey Neesham, who spearheaded the efforts to preserve Old Sacramento and make it the place that we can enjoy, and the museum is there. So Lisa Reinertsen, the sculpture for this was placed in 20 years ago, 2001, in the park. And for us, the sculpture tells the story of much of Cesar Chavez's life. Here it's commemorating an event that took place 55 years ago. In fact, on this day, 55 years ago, Cesar Chavez is marching with a growing group of people. He is in the Modesto area. By this time, 55 years ago, on Easter Sunday, he and a group of between 8,000 and 10,000 marchers, members of the Union, supporters of the march, will have arrived at the west steps of the state capitol as part of a 340-mile march, what he called a pilgrimage. He called the marchers peregrinos, pilgrims, and they were in support of a grape strike that had started the year before. Cesar Chavez was born in Yuma, Arizona. His family lost their homestead, and the family joined the ranks then of the migrant farm workers in California about the time that John Steinbeck was chronicling the Dust Bowl migrants heading to California through the lives of the Joad family. So as much indignity as that was to the families like the Joads, it was much more so because for farm workers, Latino, Mexican American, Filipino American farm workers, because of sometimes they could not speak English, racist attitudes toward the farm workers suggested that they were somehow physically suited to farm work, and so they were discriminated against much more. Cesar and his family, I keep switching this lens, Cesar and his family worked hard in the fields. His mother, Juana, was I guess you would say, the business director for the family. And she, as much as they could, timed their travels to get to the harvest and the field work at the right time to get the most money as possible. And Cesar himself was often a field supervisor for the family out in the fields, urging his siblings on to harvest more so that they could make more. And so Cesar knew firsthand the life of a farm worker and the indignities of a farm worker. He joined the Navy after the war for 2 years. He came back lived in San Jose with his wife and small children. He thought he was going to go into farm labor, and he instead met up with two Catholic priests who were at that time trying to organize Mexican Americans in the San Jose area and introduced the church to them, or reintroduced the church to them. And he also met a man named Fred Ross, who was running the community service organization targeting Mexican Americans, helping them register to vote, helping them establish their residency status, and helping with any problems they might have in cities not providing service to their neighborhood, and very much about self-determination. And that turned out to be Cesar Chavez's talent, knack. He went for it, and he quickly became a protege of Fred Ross, who introduced him to Mohandas Gandhi and Martin Luther King and the nonviolent approach that he would later use or try to use in his union. So he was heavily involved in the community service organization in San Jose, and then sent to other cities to help build these community service organizations there, and eventually was national director. When it looked like the community service organization was not going to set up to help create a union or a service organization just for farm workers, Cesar Chavez left on his birthday in 1962, moved his family to Delano, California, where he had lived partly as a youth, and started the National Farm Worker Association. He insisted for a long time that his was not a labor union. He wanted it to be an organization that would promote and help farm workers, but not necessarily a union. It became a union, or a labor organization, somewhat without his say-so at first. In Delano was another farm organization, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, run by Larry Itliong. It was mostly Filipino Americans, and they had begun a strike in 1965 against grape growers in Delano. And Larry Itliong urged Cesar Chavez to have his group join the strike. Larry Itliong said, "The growers are simply breaking our strike with Mexican Americans. They're pitting Filipino Americans against Mexican Americans. Let's join so they won't be able to do that." And even though Cesar Chavez said we were not really ready to do a labor action, he figured it was a few years away, he did join. He asked the National Farm Workers Association, his group, to vote on whether they should join, and they voted unanimously. And so this sculpture by Lisa Reinertsen depicts the event that happened a year later as a way to draw attention to the strike. Is that pilgrimage that began with 50 farm workers, members of the National Farm Workers Association in Delano, and they wound their way through the farming cities and towns of the San Joaquin Valley and reached the west steps of the Capitol on Easter Sunday, hoping to see Governor Edmund Pat Brown. He was not there, but the pilgrimage did raise the attention. And Lisa Reinertsen, by the way, she also has a sculpture in West Sacramento of baseball players near the West Sacramento City Hall. She says that she marched part of the way into Sacramento as a child. Her family were supporters of the march and the pilgrimage, and fed some of the marchers on their way in. So they're holding the flag of the United Farm Workers, which is what the organization became when it merged with the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And that man right there is Richard Chavez, Cesar Chavez's brother, and he designed the Ufw Mark, which you can see here in kind of a mural format. The wings, the Aztec-style wings, have been turned into farm fields. And the co-founder of the National Farm Workers Association and the Ufw is here, Dolores Huerta. She was also a director of the community service organization in Stockton, and she and Cesar started the organization, which then became the Ufw, Huelga Strike. In 1968, afraid that members of his union were going to disavow their pledge to nonviolence in their labor actions, and because of some incidents of violence, Cesar Chavez fasted for 25 days, and this depicts the moment when at the end of that fast, Senator Robert Kennedy came to break bread with Cesar Chavez, He was 6 days later to Robert Kennedy to announce his candidacy for presidency. The United Farm Workers rallied to support Kennedy, and in June of that year, he was assassinated. We have depictions of workers laboring in the fields. I believe this might be el cortito, a short-handled hoe, which is one of the United Farm Workers' victories in the 60s and 70s, along with the banning the short-handled hoe, which forced workers to bend low and at great pains. That was banned. By 1970, the United Farm Workers had signed contracts with those grape growers and then moved on to the lettuce fields of Salinas. As you might expect, the United Farm Workers Union faced challenges throughout. In the lettuce strike in the 70s of Salinas, the growers often pitted a rival union, the Teamsters, against the United Farm Workers, who were then affiliated with the AFL-CIO. The Teamsters would sign what are called sweetheart contracts with the growers, often without the UFW's or the growers' knowledge, and these contracts would not carry the provisions that the United Farm Workers would have wanted for their workers. And so there's always challenges. But by the 1980s, the United Farm Workers had switched to the conditions that farm workers underwent. And you can see in the mural here, the crop duster spraying pesticides. The United Farm Workers focused on the conditions such as pesticides being sprayed on them, children working in the fields. And they still, to this day, the United Farm Workers is active working on labor conditions and the conditions in the field. Cesar Chavez brought not only the symbolism of the Aztec flag, but Our Lady of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico, who, as you might know the story, appeared to a poor worker in Mexico about 500 years ago, Juan Diego, who, when the bishop asked for proof of the appearance of the Virgin Mary to him, was told by the Virgin Mary to go gather flowers out of season. And when he carried the flowers in his tilma, his cloak, to the bishop, out came the flowers, and imprinted on his cloak was this version of the Virgin Mary. And so that became a symbol, as do the phrase "si se puede," yes, it can be done. Also, "viva la causa," that's what long live the cause. That's what Cesar Chavez preferred to call his actions. Cesar Chavez, as you might expect, was like a lot of leaders, a flawed individual. He, toward the end of his time, he was well, to be frank, he had autocratic tendencies which grew out of his early life as a community service organization organizer. He outworked just about everyone who worked for him, and he disdained those who were not working as hard or as fervently as he was. And in the 80s, there were purges of the union. People he thought, even though they were longtime advocates, he pushed them out of the union. His embrace of Synanon, which was a drug treatment program turned religion, it was eventually dismantled as a criminal organization. He embraced a group therapy session that he employed at the union in late life, and some of his chief advisors and supporters bailed on the union at that point. He also embraced President Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines and seemed to endorse the martial law in the Philippines, which angered many Filipino-American members of the union. But the struggle lives on. I had the opportunity to interview Cesar Chavez later in his life, my past life as a newspaper reporter. I worked for the California Farm Bureau. I don't think those two organizations have ever shared a podium. I met him at a function to celebrate the Radio Campesina, the farm worker radio station. I waited all day long to get an interview with him. I did not mind though, because my favorite part of being a reporter is just staying in the corner of some place and observing a world that's unfamiliar to me. But he finally granted me an interview. I don't remember exactly what we talked about. I do remember he looked askance at me, wary of my affiliation with the Farm Bureau. But I do also remember that he answered me as fully as he could. So I appreciated that. Cesar Chavez, the struggle lives on. He himself did not agree with, or did not support undocumented workers or the guest worker program because it diminished the power of his members to negotiate contracts. Now, though, the United Farm Workers continues to support legislation that would give undocumented farm workers a pathway to citizenship. It continues to work on farm worker conditions. The farm workers, of course, were hard hit in the pandemic, continued to be hard hit. Efforts are underway to get vaccines to farm workers. The fight continues for farm worker wages and working conditions. The Supreme Court is now listening to a challenge of the 1975 Agricultural Labor Relations Act, the first act in the country that provided collective bargaining to farm workers who were kept out of federal law. And now growers are challenging the ability of unions to meet on growers' property at early in the morning, at lunchtime, and late at night to talk to workers. The growers are saying that is an unconstitutional taking of their property. So they're still in the fight. The struggle remains. Cesar Chavez's name lives on, of course, in this plaza. There's an elementary school here in Sacramento. There is a cargo ship in the Navy named for him. His bust appears in President Joe Biden's Oval Office. In the end, though, I don't think Cesar Chavez wanted that to be his legacy. A union member once asked him what his legacy would be, and he said, "If you want to remember me, organize." Thanks for joining us on Facebook Live. I'll just let you know that our next Facebook events are in April, are all about the Underground Tour. We are resuming the Underground Tours on Saturday, April 10th, and doing them on the weekends. So our Facebook Live Museum Monday programs will be about details you might miss on the underground route, about the archaeology of the underground spaces, and about clues to the underground that you can find without even having to go underground. And then the month of April finishes off with one of our much relished story times with our museum director, Delta Pick Mello. So thank you very much for listening to me talk about Cesar Chavez. Come visit the statue yourself and come to the museum and see more of Lisa Reinertson's work and the baseball player sculpture in West Sacramento. You'll be fascinated. You have a lot to see in this statue. So thanks very much, everybody. Glad you could make it with us. Bye.